Well, thank you very much to Georgina and Botamo and everyone who's involved in organizing Talking Galleries. I've been a huge fan of Talking Galleries since its first edition. I've watched most of the episodes that are on video online, and it was a huge honor for me to be invited to participate. And one of the first things I thought when I broke my leg was it would be horrible if, on top of breaking my leg, I was unable to come to Barcelona. So I must say a huge thank you to Conrado and to Carlos and everybody who helped me arrive here. It was absolutely eventless, and it was a real pleasure to be here. So thank you very much. Oh, good. Okay. So most of what I'm going to present today is from research for my second book, which, as Conrado mentioned, is a bit of a critique of my first book. And so I think I'll just very quickly contextualize where the point of view for this by saying that the first book was a deconstruction of what I would call the Leo Castelli model for an art gallery. And if you're not familiar, Leo Castelli was a New York art dealer who, in his day, was the Gagosian of art dealers in New York. And the model that he made very popular was to discover young artists, nurture and support their development, build a commercial market for their work as you also built a critical dialogue and essentially the argument that this work was historically important, and to look at all of this in a long-term view, the idea being that the artists were loyal to the gallery was loyal to the artist, and in good times or bad, you were all in it together, with the hope that you would grow successful and old together as well. And my first book was more or less a deconstruction of that. If you know Leo Castelli's gallery, you know that the myth that evolved around his gallery wasn't necessarily the reality of his gallery. He didn't necessarily follow that exact model with each of his artists. But that myth became, to a new generation of dealers, simply the way that it is done. This is how you operate a gallery. And so in 2008, when I wrote the book, How to Start and Run a Commercial Art Gallery, I was really looking at it in that way. The recession came very quickly, and quite a bit of criticism to my publisher for publishing a book called How to Start a Gallery, just as the economy was crashing, came about. But in the interim, quite a lot of things have started happening, and very rapidly, that made me want to go back and evaluate how true that first book really stood. Is the Leo Castelli model still a viable way to run a commercial art gallery? The new book has chapters such as the rise of the mega gallery, the rise of the art fair, the challenge of online information and online selling platforms, and a chapter that is near and dear to my heart, it's actually, the title of the chapter is The Mid-Level Gallery Squeeze. This is a topic that I have written a fair bit about on my blog, as well as participated in a discussion at Art Basel in 2013 with Josh Baer and Elizabeth D. And to be honest, when all these things were happening very quickly, I started to think that perhaps the Leo Castelli model had broken. But as I'm researching the book, the conclusion I'm coming to is the model isn't broken. It's actually still a very viable model. The difference now is the entire market has become much more complex and much more competitive than it was when I wrote the first book in 2008. But there's no point in really talking about mid-level galleries unless we sort of have a definition of what we mean. And a lot of discussions will divide galleries into three levels. Josh Baer and Elizabeth D. and I found it helpful to divide them into four, to separate mega galleries out from top-level galleries. And the definitions here were worked out in the conversation with Josh and Elizabeth, but I've sort of tweaked them a little bit for my book. And here's where I need my glasses. But a mega gallery is an influential gallery with multiple international locations, a roster of at least 40 artists, and a public perception that they are expanding their empire. And this is one of their top priorities, to expand their empire. And that's actually the difference between a mega gallery and a top-tier gallery. And a top-tier gallery may not have as many as 40 artists, but they still have international influence, maybe multiple locations. But the perception is not that they're trying to expand their empire necessarily. It's not their top priority. We'll get to the definition for a mid-level gallery in a moment. And emerging galleries, and this is a fairly arbitrary cutoff point, but I think it's helpful to talk about a gallery that is less than 10 years old. Initially, at least, has less international influence, a random number of artists in their program, and it's defined mostly by the fact that it's new and that it's probably the art dealer's first gallery. Not many art dealers who will open a second gallery would still be considered emerging. So the question then is, what would make a gallery mid-level? These 4 bullet points are more or less variations on the same theme, but some nuances that we'll discuss in some of the later slides. It may be that a gallery is simply on their way to becoming a top-tier gallery, but they're older than 10 years and they haven't reached that point yet. It may be that they're older than 10 years and the perception is that they won't gain that influence and they probably won't reach the top tier. It could be that that's the situation and it's by choice. They simply enjoy operating in the mid-level of the market. They enjoy fostering the careers of emerging and mid-career artists, and it's a curatorial preference, or perhaps they're adverse to the type of competition it requires to become a top-level gallery. And finally, it could be that this is a gallery that's kind of operating outside of what we would consider the rat race, a gallery who maybe doesn't participate in many fairs or get much press, but stays in business nonetheless and sells art nonetheless. 2 other factors I think are more important in determining what makes a gallery mid-level. The first is that they tend to have less access to the 2 resources needed to become a top-tier gallery, and those would be time and money. And of course, with more money, you can buy more time. And second, and this is something that I'm going to discuss a little bit more in depth later, you as a gallery are now judged by Art World Insiders according to the art fairs that you participate in, and not only the art fairs you participate in, but the location of your booth. So some of what might make you a mid-level gallery is a little bit beyond your control. And so we'll come back to that theme in just a few minutes. And you can't, okay, I'm sorry, I'll pull all that together into a final long working definition of a mid-level gallery. It's one that is more than 10 years old, has between 8 to 24 artists on the roster, mostly who fall within the emerging to mid-career categories. It's struggling to secure placement in the major art fairs or a good booth location in major art fairs. And it often has limited resources to take the steps that would change its position. So that's who I'm talking about when I say a mid-level gallery. And you can't talk about this and say all those things that sound very negative without asking, well, what's wrong with being a mid-level gallery? And personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a mid-level gallery. I think it's a very important part of the gallery ecosystem. And I think it's a place where artists who have passed perhaps their emerging stage, but not yet reached the blue chip stage, can continue to develop their work and experiment while having the support of a commercial gallery. I think it's a wonderful thing that the mid-level gallery system exists as it is, because I think it's an important stage in supporting and helping artists. I think it's also important at this point to mention, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a mega gallery. In fact, the chapter in my book, which says the rise of the mega gallery, goes into some strategies on, if this is your goal, how do you become a mega gallery? And so I'm not trying to say that, you know, yay, the heroes of the art world are the mid-level galleries and boo, the villains are the mega galleries. I'm really trying to just look at it objectively and strategically. But there's another way to look at this question, what's wrong with a mid-level gallery? And the reality is that the answer is there are many indications that currently the market is much better for top-level galleries and emerging galleries than it is for galleries in the middle. And even among the challenges that every gallery faces, regardless of what level they're at, there are particular problems for the mid-level gallery just because of the way the art market works. And we'll look at a couple of those as well. Another question that might emerge is, why would anybody think it's more difficult for mid-level galleries than anyone else? There's a saying that's popular where I come from: you can't throw a stick without hitting a mid-level dealer around here. And so you look around and you say, there's tons of mid-level galleries. Why would anybody think that they're struggling? Again, there is a perception, and I think I'll stop here in just a moment and say I opened this chapter in the book by noting that in a lot of businesses, how well you're doing as a business is dependent upon how well people think you're doing. And in the gallery business, this is really true more so than other industries. If a gallery is thought to be struggling, artists and collectors will avoid it. If it's thought to be doing very well, artists and collectors will gravitate toward it. So it becomes a self-fulfilling problem. If the world thinks you're struggling, then you're actually going to start struggling more because that's the perception. So there is currently this perception that the top and emerging level galleries are doing much better. And in fact, they've probably reached the same level of sales they saw in 2007. And that the mid-level gallery is not only not back to its 2007 levels, but actually sliding lower. Some published figures that came out in 2013 reinforced that notion. And I know that those figures are controversial, and so I'm not going to cite them here. But I know that those figures were also published very far and wide, and that those figures have contributed to this perception that the mid-level is struggling. And again, if people perceive the mid-level as struggling, they don't gravitate toward the mid-level galleries. Finally, in New York, and I will apologize, a lot of what I present is New York-centric. I did take an attempt at writing the book from an international point of view, but it would have taken me 4 years, so my publisher is anxious for the manuscript now. So in places where I think it's valuable to speak of what it is that I know better, I really do focus on New York. Of the galleries that have closed in New York since 2008, and there's a website that lists what they are, the vast majority of them have been mid-level galleries, or galleries that were very close to becoming mid-level galleries. That may just be normal. It may be that top-tier galleries have reached a point where it's, they're not going to struggle very much, but those numbers do contribute again to the perception that mid-level galleries are struggling. Okay, so the rest of the presentation is looking at some very specific challenges for galleries in general, and then I have in parentheses mid-level galleries, because there are some twists that affect mid-level galleries more so than the others. I've also tried to look at these challenges in business terms, basic business terms. What are we really talking about when we say, for example, that you have relatively slower sales and the loss of a key consumer sector in the context of trying to reach your goals? In that situation, I think what you have is a cash flow problem. And so when I talk about strategies, I'll sometimes phrase them in the business terms so that they're a little more concrete. I suspect I may not get through all of these, and one of the reasons I'm very excited to be here is I'm not done writing the book and very interested in feedback as well as sort of new ideas that I might incorporate in the book. So I would ask at any point if you have a question, don't wait for the Q&A section, please just raise your hand and I'll be very happy to sort of, answer your question as best I can. So relatively slower sales and loss of a key consumer sector. Whoops, too fast. What do I mean by the loss of a key consumer sector? Well, in the United States, up through 2007, the market expanded very rapidly because a new group of people started buying art. These were people who had invested in the stock market and they had their second home, their third car, and buying art seemed like a lot of fun to them. We're talking about people in the upper middle to lower upper classes, and we collectively refer to them in shorthand as perhaps the doctors and lawyers. And the doctors and lawyers were buying a lot of art in 2007, and then when the market crashed in 2008, everybody kind of stepped back and looked at sort of their long-term financial prospects and made decisions about whether to continue buying art or not. Unfortunately, the doctors and the lawyers, whose price points were more or less emerging and mid-level, are struggling as professions in the United States. These two quotes from the Wall Street Journal and the American Bar Association, which is the association of lawyers in the States, confirm that indeed these professionals are not really very confident about their future financial prospects, and so they haven't returned to collecting art, which is something you only do when you feel you have the luxury to do so. So this has impacted the mid-level of the art market. Whoops. I've also sprinkled through here some case examples to kind of drive home exactly how these topics all come together. And so again, I think cash flow is the real problem that mid-level galleries are seeing with regards to sluggish sales. If you have regular cash flow, you can keep moving. You can keep taking the opportunities that come your way. If you don't, opportunities may come your way that you have to give up. And this is where mid-level galleries are really kind of struggling. So imagine it's August, and you finally got off the waiting list and accepted into Art Basel Miami Beach. Now, I know that some of the mid-level galleries are going, yeah, that's a fairy tale. That's not going to happen, but it can happen. And actually, I would ask Annette if this is true. Would the participation fee be due immediately if you got off the waiting list in August? More or less. Okay, good. And because you'd been on the waiting list before, you weren't really expecting to get in, so you hadn't actually set the participation fee aside. And if you're like most galleries, August is a very slow sales month for you. So you call up your gallery angel, a doctor who would usually buy something when you pushed her to just to help the gallery, only she's telling you she's scaling back her art patronage. Doctors are struggling. She's not so sure about her financial future, so she passes. Then you remember you sold something at an art fair in June and that collector hasn't sent the check yet. That would really help pay the fee. You call them up, they're on vacation, and their assistant says they lost their phone on the beach. So it's the slowest part of the year for you for sales. Unfortunately, your overhead hasn't gone on vacation. Your overhead, you still have to pay the rent and everything else, but the participation fee is due. If you're a mid-level gallery, this can be a much bigger problem. Yes, hi. Excellent. So one of the strategies obviously would be to ask the fair to explain the situation and say, thank you, Annette, I appreciate that. But there's some other strategies as well that are emerging, and I have two categories of strategies for cash flow. One is very specifically for an art fair opportunity that pops up, and the other is for mid-level galleries in general. An interesting idea that's gaining a little traction is factoring, and this is where you can sell an invoice to a third party who will take a small commission, but they will give you the cash immediately. So if you have a collector who takes a long time to pay, but you really kind of need that money now, factoring can be an option. One company doing factoring is called Foundation. It was started by an art dealer and an art fair organizer. I haven't used it myself. I have looked in depth at how it works. It seems like a viable option. I know that it's one of those things you can just do case by case. So I think we may see more of that, but it really kind of depends on which way the market goes. An art fair backer, unlike the backer for a gallery, can be a one-time arrangement with somebody who more or less pays the fee for you. I've seen a number of mid-level galleries use this very successfully, and what is interesting is they make a pitch to somebody to pay the fee. What usually makes that person agree is to bring them in and have them participate in the fair in some way. Either have them sit in the booth and talk to people. It's an opportunity for them to have like an insider's behind the scene view. And if you're sitting there worrying that, oh, I do not want my dealer sitting in my booth for very long, trust me, after day 2, they're bored and they go away anyway. So another strategy here, though, is collaboration. So a lot of art fairs are starting to accept proposals that include 2 galleries, and it's usually a juxtaposition of either historical and emerging artists, or it's just an interesting pairing up. The advantage to that is, 1, a lot of fairs like those proposals, so you have a better chance of getting in, but 2, obviously, you split the costs. I have others with question marks throughout most of these strategies things, and very happy to have anybody jump in at any point and say, you know, what works for me is this, or I've tried that and I've had problems, so feel free at any point to jump in. As far as cash flow strategies for mid-level galleries in general, should point out that in talking to a lot of mid-level galleries, I'm hearing the same thing. They're selling well out of their space only 6 months out of the year, usually mid-September through mid-December, and then again March through May. And the other 6 months, they're actually losing money by having a brick and mortar space. They're just not making the sales. I talked to a dealer in Istanbul where she's a mid-level gallery, but she needs to sell $200,000 worth of art every month to make her, to make her nut, as we say. And for 6 months of the year, she can't do that. So some of the strategies, again, it's not a matter of you're going to go out of business. It's a matter of you just don't have the cash flow to take advantage of the opportunities that come along. So some of the strategies for mid-level galleries, and most people understand that getting into the secondary market is perhaps the best long-term strategy if you have a program that doesn't necessarily constantly stay solvent. Of course, getting into the secondary market requires expertise and sometimes capital itself. So it may not necessarily be the best option for everyone. Complementary businesses is something a lot of mid-level galleries are starting to talk about. And again, the idea comes from the fact that you have this space for 12 months a year, but only 6 months of a year is it profitable. So what else could you use that space for? And the types of complementary businesses that dealers are starting include art fairs, and I'm guilty of that myself. We started an art fair. I like the bookstore at Stampa in Basel. I don't know whether or not that generates profit for them, but it's a beautiful complementary business for them. Gavin Brown, as you all may know, had a bar outside his gallery in New York when he was in Chelsea for a while. But the model that I think holds the most promise is a model that a gallery in Brooklyn called Interstate is doing. They rented a very big space. They use part of it for their gallery, and they rent the rest of it out to artists for studios. So these, again, are just some of the strategies that galleries are using to keep the cash flowing. And this last idea is a little vague, but there's a gallery in Brooklyn called Transfer and one in Paris called XPO who have started systematically collaborating on promotion. So they will have shows on both sides of the Atlantic for the artists at the same time and more or less split the promotion costs for those shows. So that's another model that I think has some potential. It doesn't relate directly to cash flow, but anything that's cost savings, I think, contributes. I'm going to go quickly through this. This is depressing, but rising rents in gallery districts is an issue happening in a lot of art centers. We see it in New York, London, we're seeing it in San Francisco. I understand it might be an issue locally as well. It's obviously not happening everywhere, but for mid-level galleries, if your rent doubles, you have an issue. So you can't. And I'll point out that in Chelsea, a generation of top-level galleries very wisely, when they moved from Soho, bought their spaces. So not only does rising rent not impact them, but because they own these buildings, they now have real estate worth a small fortune, and that puts them that much further above the mid-level galleries. So you're not just trying to catch up to somebody who's got to pay the same rent as you. You're trying to catch up to somebody for whom rent is irrelevant. So strategies here again include complementary businesses. We went through that, but also the idea that's being floated a lot is this notion of the post-brick and mortar gallery. It's a very, very vague concept. I think in reality it boils down to you close your physical space and become an art consultant, but still try to do art fairs. But I've interviewed a number of art fair directors for the book, and the major art fairs are still very firm that you must have a physical space to participate, but some of the satellite fairs are softening up and saying that they would welcome a post-brick and mortar gallery to participate in their fair. So I think we're going to see a bit of an evolution there going forward. The last strategy, of course, is to relocate. And I don't necessarily mean in the same city, but I mean to a whole different region. There's 3 mid-level galleries who recently moved out of New York. Von Lintel moved to Los Angeles, Bill Brady moved to Kansas, and Jeff Bailey moved to upstate New York. There's 2 advantages to this. One, if you get out of one of the major centers, you can work with much better artists than you can if you're competing with the other galleries in that center for them. So you could have your dream program in the middle of nowhere. The other advantage is that a lot of art fairs like geographical diversity. And so if you're the only good gallery in Kansas, your odds of getting into an art fair go up than if you're one of many good galleries in New York. So obviously there's a lot of other personal things that come into this equation. But this is a strategy that we've considered. My partner Murat is from Kyrgyzstan, and we've been thinking about opening a gallery in Kyrgyzstan because we would be the only gallery for like 4,000 miles. So, which has advantages and disadvantages, obviously. Okay, so one of the things that really drove my interest in mid-level galleries was this idea of poaching. And a couple years ago, when I first started writing about this topic, there were a number of very high-level or high-profile poachings happening from mid-level galleries by top-tier galleries or even mega galleries. And I know some of these mid-level dealers very well, and I know the artists who the big galleries took were paying most of the rent or paying most of the bills in those galleries. And I knew that that had a huge impact on their ability to keep moving forward. It's not just the loss of income, it's a loss of prestige, and very often it opens up this huge hole in your curatorial program. So I started to think of poaching as an existential threat to the mid-level galleries. And it was at a time when it seemed to just be happening constantly. Anytime something bothers me that much, my instinct is to slow down and look at it in depth. And so I've done 2 in-depth bits of research that I'll share here about poaching. But just as a case example, what we're really talking about is a mid-level gallery who finds an artist that the rest of the art world isn't so sure about, but they really believe in. We're talking about the Leo Castelli model in its most beautiful form. And they promote that artist, and maybe the art fair committees say, we don't see it, maybe the press aren't so sure, but this dealer keeps plugging away. And eventually one critic writes a good review, and then they're in some group shows, and then they're in the biennial, and before you know it, collectors are interested. And maybe eventually you have a bona fide waiting list, and this artist is now supporting the gallery. As a mid-level dealer, you have a lot of personal emotions wrapped up in this. 1, you champion this person against the world. 2, you probably didn't spend as much time promoting your other artists as you could have if you had a larger staff because you were really working to promote this one. And then one day they come in and say, oh, Mega Gallery X has invited me to go and I'm leaving. So when this started happening a lot in New York, one of the things that people would talk about is what's happening with artists? Why aren't they as loyal to their mid-level galleries? This was part of the deal. And so I was interested in looking at the question of loyalty. And I put a survey online and it had 1,382 artists respond from 31 countries around the world. And I asked them to identify, do you have gallery representation or not? 40% of them said they do, 60% said they don't. I have to say that's a higher percentage of represented artists than I would expect in the general population. It's probably a reflection of my particular circle. But just to give you an overview, this is how long the artists who have representation said they've been working with their current galleries. So it's a pretty even distribution among those who are kind of new to the system and those who've been around for a while. But I asked them a question, in general, how important is loyalty to the gallery to you in your relationship? And the response was really encouraging. If you look at moderately important up to extremely important, that's close to 92% of the artists feel that loyalty is indeed important to them in this relationship. I turned the question around and asked them, how important do you think loyalty to artists is to your dealers? Here the numbers dropped a little bit, which wasn't surprising. But overall it suggested that loyalty remains an important part of the relationship between artists and dealers. Now, that is summarized here. Again, this is a confusing chart, I'm sorry. I think I just divided it between the three categories that are important and the three galleries. Yes, hello. Yes. They did. They also knew that the survey was completely anonymous and there was no way that I could tell who had answered what. So, and I have to say that the survey went viral. Artists just started passing it among their friends, which is how it got up to 1,300 respondents. But again, it suggests that at least, yes, sir. I suspect they would. Yeah. Um, there were a lot of other questions on the survey. This was simply one of them, but this was the reason for the survey. And so I think if, by the time they answered two or three other things, they were hopefully being more truthful. I totally agree. Knowing that a dealer would eventually look at these numbers, it's probably a bias that loyalty is important. And that's certainly a reality. But the real question I had is, has something changed in this generation of artists? Does this generation of artists feel that loyalty is really an old-fashioned idea and not so important? And eventually I'll come to one of the strategies, which is perhaps we just forget loyalty. Perhaps it's not relevant anymore. But this doesn't really make a lot of sense unless you ask the same thing of dealers. I put a survey up online for dealers, and I had 34 responses. It was pathetic. So completely predictable, though. Dealers don't like to discuss things like this. They certainly don't like to share information about their gallery. So I had to go about it a different way. Again, I apologize that this is very New York-centric, but I researched the movement of artists in and out of galleries in New York from 2008, when I wrote the first book, to 2014. I looked at 32 different galleries, and I made a spreadsheet for each of them of their roster in 2008 and 2014, and then I researched in detail each artist who had left their program. I used 14 mid-level galleries, 14 top-level galleries, and 4 mega galleries. In the book, I go into a lot more detail about the methodology, but it took 4 months. It was a lot of work. I'm going to focus here simply on the mid-level galleries. There's a lot of data in the book about the top and the mega galleries. But between 2008 and 2014, of the artists who were on the roster originally but no longer on the roster in 2014, on average, 66% of those artists did not have another New York gallery yet. So that suggests either they stopped being artists or they were let go by the gallery. The galleries just dropped them. That compares to 34% who did have another New York gallery, and it may be that that was just a normal evolution, or this also includes obviously the category of artists who had been poached by the bigger galleries. And the really shocking thing for me when I finally calculated all these numbers is it's 2 to 1. Dealers are essentially dropping or losing artists 2 to 1 compared to the artists who are moving on to another gallery. So the question that emerged for me is, how loyal are the dealers being to their artists? And I have to say, these numbers get a little bit better when you look at the top tier galleries. So I think this is actually a real issue for mid-level galleries. I will confess, my numbers are no better. I mean, personally, I've made the same choices, and I understand why I made them, and I assume that other mid-level galleries made them for the same reasons. But it brings into question, if loyalty really has given way, why is loyalty no longer an issue? And it may be that artists are seeing dealers drop so many artists and thinking, I might be next, so why would I be loyal to the gallery? I haven't finalized my conclusions on that. I welcome anybody's opinions about that over the week or over the next 2 days. Okay, so but 2 categories of strategies here. One is for handling poaching, and the other is for the discussion of loyalty. Obviously, the best way to handle poaching is to discuss this with an artist you represent. One of the first meetings you have. Say the day may come when Gagosian knocks on your door and says he wants to show you how will we together make that transition? So if you talk about it up front, then it becomes a lot less awkward if it actually happens. All the artists I know who have been poached by a bigger gallery were going. There was no talking them out of it. So the second point is to stay on friendly terms. I know it can be a very personal thing, but your key goal here is to continue to have whatever access you can to that work. You probably still have collectors who are interested in it, and you will have questions about, well, you had promised me the next painting, why can't I get it? Do I now have to go to the mega gallery and get it? So I would say, despite how much it may hurt personally, stay on as friendly terms as you possibly can with that artist. And I watched Alain Servet's presentation last year, and I think his FIFA idea, the summary of which, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the Federation of International Football Associations, they have a practice where if a minor team player is poached by a major team, that major team has to pay that minor team for a reimbursement of the training. And applying this to the art world seems to me like a very solid idea. Almost every dealer I've talked to said it's not workable. I think, however, it can become workable if we simply start doing it. I had a conversation in New York a few weeks ago with a mid-level gallery who's thinking of poaching an artist from a emerging gallery. And I said, you know how it felt when a top-level gallery poached one of your artists. How are you going to change this? And so we talked a little bit about it, and she said that she agreed she will offer that emerging gallery access to work by this artist over 3 years. And I think this transition is a really good practice, and I think it could help soften up sort of the animosity that's developing around poaching. It's not quite the FIFA model, but I think if you start, I don't know, there may be a lot of potential for that model, but I think it involves a lot more contracts. But I think contracts are part of our future anyway.
Relationship, which is a little bit what you're describing between a gallerist and an artist. When you get married, you sign a contract. So why can't you sign any contracts between a gallerist and an artist? Why do you think it is? It is completely nonsense. Because can you accept that your main assets could be walking out of the door like if nothing happened, like the same thing in a marriage or any business relationship? Why don't you think about that as the most obvious solution?
I agree with you. In fact, the last third of the book is all about contracts. I think it's simply not the way it has been done. So there's just, the inertia of never having really done it that way. And so this is why the dealers are a little less inclined.
I wanted to make a comment from a collector's point of view. Mm-hmm. One of the questions I always try to determine with a gallerist is how secure that relationship is before we make in-depth purchases. Right. I've worked with collectors in the past who seem to use a model and presently where they don't buy encyclopedic but rather 150 pieces of one artist in an initial purchase and then large amounts after. And it's very dangerous for us to deal with dealers who have not secured these relationships legally, because if they drop the artist or the artist leaves to a gallery that's not efficient at career development, our investment is wiped off the map. So I think that increasingly you're going to see collectors almost demanding this kind of clearer, more secure relationship so that our investments are also secure.
That becomes a good argument for contracts, obviously. If collectors simply won't buy from you unless you have that security. I know a number of my collectors won't buy out of a group show unless we promise we're going to represent the artist. I mean, and it makes total sense.
I just wanted to say that last year's Talking Galleries, we had a panel about contracts. So you can look at that on the Talking Galleries website if anybody wants to look. But overwhelmingly, there aren't contracts at the moment, and
I
the
know.
relationship between the artist and the dealer, almost to an extent, is sort of an emotional thing that they don't want them. So that is perhaps something that will evolve. But certainly, the panelists we had and the people we had last year, the audience, virtually nobody had contracts.
I think that it also comes again a little bit from that romance of the Leo Castelli model. I don't actually know if Leo had contracts with his artists. I know he paid him stipends, so I guess that there was something. But there is this sort of handshake, sort of romance that, you know, we're in this together, and of course we all love each other, and we love each other until we don't. But I'm not married. I don't know. But no, I do understand. I understand your point. And I think your point in general about contracts, I mean, the industry is becoming simply too big, and there's too much money involved for it not to eventually go that way.
But isn't it certain part of the... I mean, we need to also remember that the art world benefits by not having, or the art system, or part of it, by not having a lot of regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there are other collectors, a new breed of collectors, Stefan Szymowicz specifically, who benefit by there not being a lot of contracts out there.
Yeah.
They become de facto galleries themselves.
I wouldn't mind if Stefan had to sign a few contracts, actually. But that's another topic.
Can you elaborate on this, the stipend of the gallerist to the artist? Because in a way, that does establish a kind of contract. If you've been receiving a stipend for 2 to 3 years before a show, you can't up and leave because you're going to have to pay back the stipends or the production costs. So.
Indeed. I'm working with a lawyer on a section in the book on contracts, and it really is the end of the relationship that the contracts are important for. I mean, you know, when things are going well, it's all fine, but the end of it has to be spelled out in extreme detail for, you know, it to be effective or sort of reassuring. The last strategy I'll jump into real quick. Any mid-level gallery out there who has a best-selling artist, buy the work. That way, if Larry Gagosian poaches them and starts adding zeros to their prices, you're good. You know, it's like, go Larry. So, but, and a lot of mid-level galleries, again, have cash flow issues, so buying the work doesn't necessarily occur to them as an important part of the strategy. But it really, really is if you have a well-selling artist. So questions on loyalty. Honestly, it was earth-shattering for me to come to the conclusion that we mid-level galleries are responsible for the loss of loyalty in these relationships. And so I've done some soul searching, and I think it's really important for galleries to encourage loyalty, especially if you have a young dealer coming to you and asking how it works. And what I really mean here perhaps relates to the second point. Maybe don't offer representation to an artist until you're sure. I think what's been happening is this sort of, they say this in Hollywood, we're going to get a bunch of actors and throw them against the wall and see which ones stick, and we'll keep the ones that stick and we'll let the other ones go. I think a lot of mid-level galleries have been kind of doing that, but offering representation up quick in case that artist sticks, you've got this closer relationship to them. I think we need to step back and rethink that a little bit. I think it's all moving too quickly, and artists are ending up represented by galleries before the gallery even knows if they actually can build a viable market for their work. The last strategy here is possibly let's forget loyalty. Maybe it's possibly one of those things that was never really there. And perhaps we really just need to go the way of contracts. This kind of breaks my heart a little bit because, you know, I do like the Leo Castelli model, but it's simply possibly a reality that things are moving so quickly that it just doesn't make as much sense as it did back in the 1960s. Okay. Back to the idea that perception drives success and influences success. Speaking of Stefan Szymowicz, another sort of flurry of activity happened in New York where collectors were buying the work of emerging artists and then flipping it at auction for astronomical increases on what they had paid. I think one artist notoriously had a work appreciate by 1,500%. And so the perception became that we saw a new breed of people come in and start buying art. I would even hesitate to call them collectors. And that this was shifting the culture of collecting contemporary art away from an approach based on connoisseurship to one based more and more on speculation. This poses a particular problem for mid-level galleries that it doesn't for top tier or emerging galleries. And the reason is that at the top tier with your blue chip artists, the assumption is that connoisseurship's built in. You can put your money safely into a blue chip artist because they've been vetted, you know, they've got the critical acclaim, they've got the museum shows under their belt. It's a much safer place to put your money. Emerging artists, the price points are so low, you buy work by 6 artists, only one of them does well, you've actually still probably seen a fairly solid return on your investment. In the middle level though, when the price points are so high that people really aren't going to snap them up, but you don't have the blue chip status to convince everybody that you've got long-standing value here, your only sales technique really is to appeal to their sense of connoisseurship. And so if the culture evolves away from connoisseurship, mid-level galleries struggle here more so than the other ones. So, but what's the reality? Again, at the beginning of 2014, there was a flurry of headlines about art flippers chasing, and there's this quote from Bloomberg that fueled by a flood of new collectors, flipping art has intensified recently as works by untested artists resell for escalating prices. Much later in the year, the New York Times, looking at that, commissioned 2 studies, and thank you for sending me that, and came to the conclusion, these 2 studies, that the contemporary works appearing at auction within 3 years of their creation are not coming to auction faster, and that flipping remains very much the exception rather than the rule, and that the more works are coming up in volume, the percentages are more or less the same as they were in 2007. In other words, flipping is not driving everything. But the horse, as we say, is already out of the barn. The perception is that speculation is now an important component of collecting. 2 case studies, and these are both true. The previous case studies were kind of loosely based on things, but these are actually true stories. A mid-level dealer in New York had a collector who would regularly buy 4 or 5 pieces over the course of the year at the mid-level prices. And in contacting this collector, the collector said, you know what, I think I would be a fool not to get in on the speculation game. So rather than buy 4 or 5 pieces, they were saving up all that money to try and get 1 piece by a hot artist, thinking that, you know, everybody else is making money in this. Why am I the only one sitting here not making any money? So this became a serious problem for this one mid-level dealer. The second, a top 200 collector, and by top 200 collector, I mean somebody's on the list that Art News publishes every year, had 3 friends in finance come to him and say, I want to start collecting like you do. And he recommended them to one of New York's top consultants. Within 2 minutes, each of these 3 financial wannabe collectors said, what I'm really interested in is buying something that's going to double in price by next year. Thankfully, this consultant refused to work with them, but she reported back to the person who had sent them to them that this is who you're sending me. This is the new influx of people interested. So my point being that the perception is actually kind of ahead of the reality at this point. Maybe the reality is that flipping is not out of control, but people are making decisions and people are coming into the market based on this notion that you can turn a fast buck in a contemporary market. So the strategies for dealing with this, first and foremost, share the facts if you're a dealer. The New York Times listed several of the artists who during the last flipping frenzy were kind of the top selling artists. And I researched their auction estimates today. Only one of them is still doing well. The other 6 have completely bottomed out, which means most of the people who were flipping back in 2008 lost a small chunk of change. So share that with any collector who thinks that, oh, I should get in on this flipping game. It's like, you know, collector who came to the mid-level dealer said, I feel like I'd be a fool if I didn't do this. It's like, no, actually, you're probably a fool to try and do it because most people are going to lose money. Another alternative, though, is honestly for mid-level galleries, get in on the game. And by that, there's a very respected gallery in New York, strong conceptual program. We were having drinks with them a couple years ago, and they said, we have to get some painters. We have to get some abstract painters and start showing them this is what's flying out of the boobs at the fair. And honestly, they did. They went out, they got a few, and those artists are paying their rent now. So, I mean, there's simply a reality to this as well. I'm trying to be very sort of objective, even though I have my romantic notions. This is working for some galleries. So, okay, I'm going to flip forward here, because I realized this morning I have these slightly out of order. The next challenge relates very much to the fact that galleries are selling more and more out of art fairs than ever before. And again, mid-level galleries wanting to get to the top tier have to deal with the fact that you're perceived to be in a particular level based on which fairs you get into and your placement in those fairs. So a lot of mid-level dealers think that whatever it takes, I have to claw my way into these major fairs. They think that their fortunes will change and they'll start becoming more and more of a top-level gallery if they do. There is a really interesting set of paradoxes that go along with this thinking. At the core of this is the fact that a major art fair costs a significant amount of money. And if you're a mid-level gallery and you have the typical cash flow issues, how do you get more money to pay for a major art fair? Like maybe you can claw your way in, but how do you get more money? You need to make more sales than you're making now. So what a lot of galleries end up having to do is to pay for the major fair they get into, they have to do a couple additional other fairs. So, and they may think, well, you know, I'm going to go do this other regional fair and I'll bring some expensive artwork and I'll sell that and I will make the money to pay for the major fair. I was talking with the director of one of the best satellite fairs in the world. It's the type of fair where many galleries will sell out their booth in the very first day. And those of you who know will know which fair I'm talking about. I won't say just yet because I haven't vetted it with this director. But in the interview, she said, galleries who bring work over a certain price point never sell it. They always take it home. Collectors will treat each fair as having an appropriate price point at which they'll buy the work. So if your idea is to like do an additional fair to make the money to pay for the major fair and like bring something expensive, you're going to find you can't sell the expensive work until you get into the major fair. So we've got this other paradox going around. Finally, to get the attention of the selection committees of the major fairs, a lot of mid-level galleries have to propose something that really stands out, either like a major installation or something that, quite frankly, often ends up being unsellable. So you've got, again, this vicious cycle where you're proposing something you can't sell to get into a major fair so that it changes your fortunes, and yet to do that, you're doing all these additional fairs where you have to sell work that isn't as expensive because people won't buy it in that context. All of this comes back to the strategy that mid-level galleries have about this notion that whatever it takes, I have to get into the major fairs. And honestly, I think it's time to slow down just a little bit in thinking how urgently you need to do that. Because some high-profile galleries have decided to close lately, close very specifically because they got caught up in this kind of vicious circle. So I think going back, there is absolutely no question that a large percentage of collectors are buying a significant percentage of the work that they buy at fairs or online. So this is a survey I did of collectors, and collectors answered in much stronger numbers than the dealers did. I was very happy. And I know from talking to them, they sent me emails behind the scenes. This includes a fair number of top 200 collectors. But up to 50% of them are buying up to 50% of the art they buy through either fairs or online channels, or in some context outside the traditional gallery visit. They don't walk into the gallery and say, I'll take it. They're buying the work somewhere else. So if you're ignoring that sector, if you're not participating in fairs, you're missing huge potential in terms of sales. I also researched the number of fairs worldwide that have either a focus or a strong component on contemporary, and there are now 220 fairs every year that have contemporary art as their main focus, which means any given weekend there's at least 4 art fairs happening somewhere in the world. David's Werner Gallery recently reported he does 15 fairs a year. So if you're a mid-level gallery and you're trying to compete to become a top-level gallery in the context of fairs, you've got some significant challenges, none the least of which, again, are time and money. So if you want to compete at that level, if you want to increase the number of fairs you're doing or start doing better fairs, what do you need to do that? Well, you need additional staff because you can't be in those many places at once. Obviously, you have additional expenses with travel and shipping and accommodations, and it doesn't help that hotels in every major city that has fairs knows that that's the fair week and they jack the prices up. The thing that really is starting to impact mid-level galleries is the additional pressure on your roster to create enough work to do the additional fairs. So if you're a top-tier gallery or a mega gallery and you have 40 artists, you have a lot to choose from. If you're a mid-level gallery that's typically between 12 to 20 artists and they're all preparing for solo shows and they have multiple galleries, but you're coming to them and say, I need more work for fairs, that's pressure on them. That actually starts to change the art they make. And this becomes a real significant, much bigger issue than the survival of an individual gallery. This starts to impact the art that we are, that our generation's seeing. Obviously, there's additional time on the road, away from your gallery, away from your artist and your family. And then again, the additional money it costs to do these fairs, meaning that you have to do more sales and get kind of wrapped up in that vortex I was talking about. So strategies here include perhaps resist the pressure to do the major fairs until you're ready. Don't let yourself pressure, don't pressure yourself to do it, and don't let your collectors or artists pressure you to do it until it makes sense. Stop and think, is this actually the right thing for us right now? Choosing, what happened to my text? I don't know what happened. That's weird. Okay. Also, choose the fairs you participate based on very long-term goals. A few years ago, I heard that China was exploding. The market was really hot. And I'll thank Annette, who talked me through some of these things. If a mid-level gallery decides to try and do a art fair in China, because you don't have blue chip artists necessarily, and because you may not have Chinese artists, you probably have to invest a large number of years in that market for it to eventually pay off for you. So don't waste your money sort of dabbling in markets unless you're ready to invest in them long term. And it's not really just a matter of paying for the fair that number of years. If you start getting collectors there, they're going to expect you to come visit them. They're going to expect some service. So do you have the resources to develop a market for your artists in those places? Start thinking that way. Also, in talking to art fair dealers or art fair directors and dealers, it seems at the mid-level there is a peak, a sort of optimal number of fairs that you can do before it starts to pull apart at your resources. A lot of younger galleries will kind of scale up initially to about 8 fairs a year and then almost systematically scale back to 4 or 5 or 6. So I would say if you know that you're going to eventually scale back to 4 or 5 or 6, maybe don't go up to 8. I know a lot of times you need to do a fair just to figure out whether or not it's actually going to work for you. But just keep in mind that there is a maximum number. I don't know where we are on time. 10 minutes. I have one more topic. It's not as interesting. But I think maybe I should just stop and see if people have questions. If not, I can go to the last topic. Okay, I will. The internet. The internet is changing more or less the authority that every dealer has. There was a time when an art dealer had complete control over the information about what artwork was available and control over who got to buy it. But the internet is giving artists, first of all, more say, not just in sort of, publicizing and promoting their work, but even on the secondary market aspect. The thing that happened with Wade Guyton a month or two ago, where he tried to disrupt the auction at Christie's, was fascinating. I don't know that in the end it ended up doing anything, but it was just the potential for an artist to say, you know what, I have some control here now. Like, it has evolved a far way away from when Rauschenberg punched or pushed Skull. So, but pricing isn't the only information. Pushed, touched lovingly. I've seen the video. He didn't actually punch him. That's a nice little myth as well. So, but this quote from Vogue, I think, is a really important thing for every gallery to think about, is now able to sell artworks themselves, artists are nudging the dealers out of the way, challenging what has long been seen as an industry shrouded in pretense and exclusivity. So the case I want to look at here is one where one of your artists has become enamored with Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or anything, and he just keeps putting up images from his studio of works in progress. And you get calls from people who are his friends on Facebook and interested in buying it. And they're talking about a piece of artwork that you don't even know exists yet because you haven't been following your artist on Instagram or Facebook. Not only that, they're friends with your artist, and they had a little chat with them on Facebook, and they said, I'm kind of interested in getting that piece. And the artist said, thankfully, well, contact my gallery and tell them you want it. And so you have now a waiting list for this artist, and somebody's calling you out of the blue who gets offended when you say, well, tell me something about your collection. And they report back to your artist, wow, your dealer's horrible. So how can you manage this flow of information completely outside of your control? This is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. One of the strategies, of course, again, is to discuss this up front with your artist. Let them know that, in the context of we expect sales to come through the gallery, one of the things that you can do when you are putting images up on Facebook or Instagram, as my partner Murat says, hashtag the gallery. He tells all the artists, hashtag the gallery, which means more or less put a link to the gallery's social media or even to the gallery's website on every image you put up there. This could become more complicated if your artist has multiple galleries, but it's certainly something that's fair to ask the artist to do. The other thing, of course, is there's no point in hashtagging the gallery if there's nothing online for that person to see when they get to it. So the galleries need to be on all these social medias as well and have very active accounts. I mean, it's a great thing if this friend of your artist contacts you and wants to buy that painting, but it's even better if they find your other artists and become interested in them as well. And again, this is one of those categories where I have other and question marks. I'm very curious of the experiences of other dealers and how information on the internet is jostling or causing problems for you. But this is actually the last slide, so. Yes, hi. I think they're going to bring you a microphone.
Just listening to what you were saying about that last point, I've got an artist friend in London who works at the Midlevel Gallery in London, and she has exactly this problem that she feels that her gallery aren't working with her, day by day, because obviously they're doing a show with another artist at that time. Yeah. And so she has this constant sort of desire to self-promote while the gallery's not out there every day talking about her. Yeah. But equally, when she does then try and put clients and potential clients that have been generated through her social media feeds in touch with the gallery, as you say, there's often a bit of argy-bargy and not necessarily the results that everyone wants. So right. I guess, from my point of view, I've suggested to her that she really goes and talks to her dealer about these things and makes sure that they are working together on this, because, the artists are very, very keen to use social media, as you've quite rightly pointed out, to build their own brands and their own markets. And so it's, I think it's a really important topic.
And for the dealers as well, it's important to, in that conversation, note perhaps, I've got these relationships with collectors based on the idea that I will present work to them first, because they've bought a lot of work from you, and I've promised them that every new piece that comes along, I'll give them an opportunity to look at it before we show it to other people. And the artists may not actually know that. And so that's important to communicate back the other way, is that, this is somebody who supported you a lot in the past, and we want to be respectful and show them this work first. So maybe let your internet friends know that you have to kind of have a conversation with the gallery before promising them something. Other questions?
What if there isn't a waiting list for this particular artist? What if there isn't a waiting list for that particular artist? I mean, shouldn't the dealer, particularly a mid-level dealer, just drop the fucking pretense and sell the work?
Well, as I say,
what's the point of being a snob, frankly, at that point? If you're adjusting yourself somehow or other to possibly a new reality that's basically sort of exhibiting itself online.
Well, as I point out here, it's a nice problem to have collectors call you out of the blue. It's like, yes, more of that, please. It's simply an issue when there's this expectation among people who've been supporting the gallery a lot longer that these conflicts happen. Yeah, absolutely. If there's no waiting list, and the other tricky thing, of course, is information getting out ahead of the dealer knowing about it. They're like calling you asking, "Oh, can I have that blue painting?" You're like, "The blue painting? What's the blue painting?" So.
Well, I think it's, as a gallery, it's not enough to be hashtagged from Instagram, because those people who are coming to the gallery through Instagram, I think they are in most cases very different from our traditional clients. Mm-hmm. So through Instagram, we can reach new people and a new type of clients. Right. And just to be hashtagged does not prepare me as a gallerist to deal with these new type of clients. I mean, galleries will have to develop new strategies, new approaches to such clients.
Do you have ideas on that?
You have to be active yourself with the gallery on all these platforms.
Right.
No, otherwise, you cannot compete if you are not online with your information. And in best case, of course, you cooperate with your artist. You let not the artist do it just herself alone.
Right.
That doesn't mean to forbid the artist to do that. That's very welcome. But to be part of the whole strategy. And that needs to change the whole attitude of a gallery, I mean, towards these new people.
I totally agree. Yeah.
I just wondered if you would like to say anything about artists using agents.
Yeah, I think that's part of the future as well, especially for artists who have multiple galleries. It's a brave new world. I don't think we have much choice in that matter. My thinking on it, honestly, is we've worked with an artist who has a gallery manager, and this artist has multiple galleries. And it's more or less like any relationship in the world. We try and be nicer to that gallery manager than any of the other galleries are, so we have better access. And I mean, there's just no way of sort of saying that they should go away, or agents are a problem. I think they're actually a solution, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to connect the dots with them in the most efficient way, most productive way.
I have working. Yeah, I have two comments. First of all, we make presumptions in the art world that certain centralized fairs are what galleries need to get into. I'm currently working in Africa, and the thing, to my surprise, after having been gone for 25 years, is the enormous amount of wealth, mainly generated through mining, and enormous collectors. These people are not on the radar, so they buy in from local galleries, local artists. When I ask them, oh, when are you going to Art Basel? They've never been. They're not on the radar of a lot of these fairs.
Right.
So is there some kind of justification for galleries going to these regions? I know, I mean, China's an example. It's an unknown territory. It's hard to, but perhaps sometimes we might have to take the mountain to Buddha and not the other way around. And the second question I had is, do you have any information about the phenomena of biennales, etc., on the impact of selling? Because many of us don't buy from art fairs because the work is way too small.
Right.
And we seek work out biennales because of scale and also because of critical importance. I find artists push themselves really hard on those platforms. And what percentage of sales, is it justifiable for galleries to put resource in to help production for a biennale, or is the sales of biennales not enough?
I have mixed feelings about sales through biennales, only because I mean, I'm again romantically thinking that that's the least commercial of all the contexts. Honestly, I know it is. I know it is. Somebody recently said they buy 75% of the work they buy from biennales. And of course, artists work really hard on those pieces because they love that context. And so I think partly what you're asking is, should we expose the fact that this is actually a selling context? And, should we exploit the fact that this is a selling context? And this is where my hesitation comes in, because then we've taken one more context in which artists feel really good about showing their work and made it commercial. So the reality is, work is selling out of there. And, it's obviously going to catch up eventually, and there's probably no point in pretending. But I don't know exactly how I would promote something in a biennale as easily or as sort of directly as I do at an art fair. I think it's kind of treacherous ground. I don't know.
I don't think you have to. It promotes itself.
No, well, fair enough. Yeah.
It's more the strategy of whether a gallerist decides to pursue curators who work on the biennale circuit, because I think a lot of gallerists use fairs or gallery time to make sales, whereas a curator, if you pursue the curators, they put them on the biennales. And there is a large percentage of collectors now. I would say that we buy 99% of our work off biennales. And it's very easy because they just stand in the spaces on the opening day. And they don't have to hard sell. The work, as you say, it sells itself. So the question is there validity for gallerists to pursue, to court curators for this final outcome?
I imagine you might see a little bit of pushback from curators if they understand that that's the reason you're approaching them. I mean, they probably understand already that that's kind of the way it's working. But if it's really overt, then, if I called a curator and said, come see this artist, and they knew that I was selling out of every biennial, I think that may have some pushback eventually. I don't know. I'm too romantic. I just...
The thing about Venice is that it used to be up front that there was
Yeah.
that there were sales,
Right.
and not only that, but there was a specific agent that got a nice little commission.
Right.
And so Venice actually funded itself at the beginning, essentially by selling art and by helping galleries make those sales. The issue is how, and I think the issue, throughout your talk, and I think a number of talks that we're probably going to hear in the next 2 days, is transparency.
Right.
And how willing are we to entertain a scenario that's perfectly transparent in terms of its interest, or more transparent in terms of its interests?
Yeah.
And how we basically sort of balance it out once we see interest A and interest B. But yeah, biennials are legendary for being
Supermarkets.
exactly being lots of money.
No, of course.
We have some time for one final question.
Okay.
Thank you for choosing me. A question, is more a question and a remark from a collector. So that was interesting to listen to you. I've been collecting for 30 years, so I have two things to say. I think that very bluntly, we speak of the art market, but it's a market, it's the market of art. And you should not forget that if it's a market, there is a certain number of rules which are common to all types of market. And the terms loyalty in market, and especially to consuming market, for me is something very special. I don't know what's loyalty in the other markets, and I don't think that loyalty exists in any type of market.
Right.
This is my first thing. The other thing I tell you is from my personal adventure, if I can say, in collecting. We've been collecting for 30 years, and I think that 80% of the works that we collect come from mid-sized gallery, not big galleries.
Thank you.
And just for one reason, I think that in art you need to be guided, and you cannot be guided by an auction catalog or by an online platform.
Right.
And I think there is a great future for the mid-level galleries if they do their job, which means if they stay, as people who can guide the others and who have also a kind of ownership.
Right.
Perhaps I'm a little bit romantic and I'm in the Castelli mood, but I think that's how it's functioning for me.
You've come to the same conclusion I'm coming to, which is that it's not a matter of completely dismissing the importance of these relationships and connoisseurship. It's simply a matter of understanding how these other things are now kind of coming in from all these different angles and impacting what we were saying dealers need to do. You need to now strategize around fairs. You need to strategize around the internet. And so you can't just be Leo Castelli in 1970 where there's no internet and, it's all sort of much more simple. It's simply more complex now.